Friends, thank you for being with us. We'll start in about 1 minute. And just so you know, given the panel nature of tonight's conversation, you'll notice that the video your videos are not accessible tonight, but you are certainly welcome to interact with our panelists through the chat. We'll talk about that in just a second.
Good evening, everybody. I hope everybody's doing well. I hope many of you know that I'm Rabbi Josh Aronson, and I really want to welcome all of you tonight to tonight's conversation, Unpacking Los Angeles Criminal Justice System, How the Past Informs the Present. This program is part of our Temple Judea's extensive racial justice initiative. And this particular series of talks, which tonight is the first, is called Uncomfortable Conversations, and it's the first in a 3-part speaker series on issues surrounding criminal justice and race here in the city of Los Angeles. I think, as many of you know, Los Angeles faces significant challenges with how our criminal justice system engages with people and communities of color. And despite attempts at reform, including under the auspices of a Justice Department consent decree, the relationship between the criminal justice system and communities of color continues to suffer from a deficit of trust. I'm grateful to our panelists this evening who have taken their own time to help us understand some of this history and set the stage for our 2 panels to come on the future of police reform and criminal reform. And I'd like to introduce our panelists and give some brief biographical information. I'd like to once again welcome from Cal State Northridge, from CSUN, Dr. Josh Sides. Josh holds a PhD in U.S. history from the University of California at Los Angeles, and he now occupies the Whitsitt Chair in California History at CSUN. He teaches and writes about the history of race, public policy, and Los Angeles. He's the author of L.A. City Limits, African American Los Angeles Since the Great Depression, and several other books about California. From the University of Southern California's Department of Public Safety, it is an honor to welcome for the first time to Temple Judea, Chief John Thomas. Chief Thomas is a native of Los Angeles who spent 21 years as a member of the LAPD, and he retired with the rank of lieutenant, having worked in patrol assignments across the city. He was also assigned to the Gang Enforcement Detail in South Los Angeles, Operation South Bureau Crash, and worked undercover narcotic enforcement, for which he was awarded LAPD's Meritorious Unit Citation and the city's Angel Award for Outstanding Community Enhancement. Chief Thomas graduated from Crenshaw High School and attended UCLA, where he was appointed editor-in-chief of NOMO, the student news magazine for the African American student body and community. He holds a BA in political science and liberal arts, and is currently at the USC Price School of Public Policy. I'm pleased to welcome them both, and I turn the program over to my colleague, Rabbi Rosenstein.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Aronson, and thank you all for joining us this evening. I'm so grateful for this Temple Judea community and our lay leaders at the forefront of our racial justice initiative, to David Altschul and Barbara Roscoe-Graff, along with Carol Carter and Jim Grant, who really helped this evening come into being. So much of the racial justice work that we do is rooted in education and opening ourselves to history and stories we did not know, with the hopes that we might be changed in hearing from our panelists and the diverse expertise they bring. To those of you joining us, whether from Temple Judea or other communities throughout Los Angeles and beyond, welcome. We're so glad that you're with us this evening. As we hear from our panelists, please feel free to ask questions of them by typing them into the chat, where I will receive them, and time permitting, I will select some of them for our panelists to address. You'll also note that your cameras are not on, as the focus of the evening is truly in the conversation and the wisdom that they have to offer. As a way of opening, we note that the history of criminal justice systems in this city are multi-layered and connect to many different social, political, and demographic shifts, and depend on many of the strong personalities in the city, in the police, in the DA's office, and in activist leadership. There are many policies and historical moments that we can turn to tell this story, whether it's the country's war on drugs and California's 3 strikes policy, the Rodney King beating, the resulting Christopher Commission, and the acquittal of the beating officers that led to the 1992 LA riots, the Rampart scandal and the ensuing Justice Department consent decree, or the movement towards gang violence intervention, community policing, and alternative sentencing for minor drug offenses. Dr. Sides, you bring us your expertise and as a historian, and Chief Thomas, in addition to your own research, you bring the lived experience of an LAPD officer who worked closely with successive chiefs of police. So I'd love to open this up by asking each of you to share an overview of LA's history of criminal justice and its impact upon cities of color. And then we will continue by diving in more granularly on some of these different moments and personalities. Chief Thomas, I'd love for you to start us off.
Well, Rabbi, it's great to be here. I thank Temple Judea for the invitation. And let me start, because I have to go back to where all of my perceptions derive from. I grew up in South Central Los Angeles, and I think that probably has more of an impact on how I view my career in public service than anything else. You know, I grew up in South LA. I'm 59 years old, so I lived through a lot of the issues that caused the city, the Black community in Los Angeles, to have a very strained relationship with law enforcement and the criminal justice system. So I went into the LAPD with my eyes wide open. I never knew a cop before I became one. Matter of fact, I didn't even know how to get to the academy the day before I was supposed to start. So my perceptions were through that lens. Again, growing up in South LA, I did not know anyone who had never been stopped by the police, who had never had an issue with being stopped as a result of fitting the description of. You know, I've been handcuffed, been through all of that. Never ever committed a crime, as you mentioned. Went straight from Crenshaw High School to UCLA. So it was my lens in which I view the profession was dirty. It was tainted. It was not, you know, I wasn't one of those people that had a great desire. I think my desire to be in law enforcement was primarily I wanted to be in a profession where I could make a difference. I also wanted to be in a profession, I wanted to be a reflection of what I thought was the type of officer that the Black community needed. Had a great career at LAPD. I worked some great assignments, but my heart was always in South Los Angeles. Many of my peers growing up in South LA, guys that I grew up with were much smarter than I thought I was. They just didn't have a chance. They did not have the investment. And in a lot of ways, the system was stacked against them. Because one of the things that I will repeat throughout my discussion today is unless you deal with the trauma in the communities, Black and brown communities, law enforcement is just one small piece. The criminal justice system is one small piece. Now, don't get me wrong, those are ideal places to start, but you still have to address the dysfunctional educational systems, the healthcare systems, and all of those things that cause for the individuals like I was to have those interactions with law enforcement and shape their worldview based upon that perception that you're less than and likely criminal. And one small mistake or one officer who perceives you as somewhat of a threat, your whole life, you're caught up in the system, and it's very easy. And I know too many guys that was their reality. So I want to paint a picture starting from there and then build upon what happened afterwards, because it was a transformative process. And I still see that there's a lot of work that needs to be done in law enforcement, criminal justice system, but I'm not willing to let those other institutions off the hook as complicit in the destruction of those communities also. So hopefully I answered your question. It's kind of a long-winded response, but that's how I would like to start.
Thanks for starting us off. Absolutely. And Josh, how do you see it from your side of from the historical side of the perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I arrived in Los Angeles in 1994, and I started working, taking the bus over from UCLA to a library over on 62nd in Vermont. I don't know why, I just was very interested in the Southern California Library, which I know, I want to call him Chief Thomas, but he insists on JT, so I'll go with JT.
JT is preferred.
Yeah, and I, you know, in 1994, it was still, the city was still smoldering, you know, I mean, metaphorically, in South LA was, you know, a lot of burnout lots and a lot of anger and frustration, and I walked into that library and started interviewing people and talking about it, and I just became kind of very committed to understanding and writing about and teaching about what had happened in this city, which is of course not that different than what's happened throughout the history of the United States, but it seemed so acute here and so devastating. And so I've tried to, make that, to tell that story to students over the last 20 years, and with mixed success. But that was my entree into it. And then, and then I would just say by way of just a broad kind of synopsis, I mean, it's well known to everybody probably in this session here, all looks like 40 people here, the history, the really shameful history of racism and discrimination and violence. But I really wanted to understand more about the various ways that's operated in our society and shaped people's experiences, JT's, and then people many generations before him. I mean, and so part of what I was interested in is doing a lot of research on the first major waves of African Americans who came out to Los Angeles in the 40s, mostly from Texas and Louisiana, and trying to understand how they made sense of the law enforcement regime of LA, which was, despite being pretty vicious, was still preferable to the law enforcement systems they'd experienced in Shreveport or Morgan City or even Houston. And so that's sort of how I came to this issue.
Chief Thomas Date, you have right behind you, right, a beautiful sort of artifact that maybe can help us launch into this story, right? That why don't you describe it for us, for those of us who are watching, and talk to us about its significance for sort of the beginning story, the beginning of the part of the story of connections between law enforcement, the Black community here in Los Angeles.
The law enforcement in the city of Los Angeles it's so contradictory. LAPD hired its first Black officer in 1889, Robert William Stewart, who was born enslaved in Kentucky. And there's been Black officers on LAPD ever since. His story was tragic. His career was cut short when he was arrested and falsely accused of rape of a 15-year-old white girl. Now, he was acquitted and was not allowed to ever join the department again as a result of a decision by the police commission in the city. But since then, there's always been Black officers. Hired his first Black female officer in 1916, Georgia Ann Robinson. But this photo is very significant to me. In 1940, LAPD hired its first two Black patrol watch commanders. Had never had Black men in those positions before. They took the civil service exam, passed the exam, and came out on top. The LAPD decided, that to ensure that they would never oversee and supervise or manage white officers, they created this all-Black watch specifically for them. So the roots of racism inside the LAPD was deep. There during the periods of prior to that and during this period, there were active KKK recruitment signs inside the police stations. But the Black officers, both female and male, did extremely well and have always had a presence. So I love this picture because it's such a telling story. And the two gentlemen that are sitting to the right of the woman, I can move over a little bit, they were the first two lieutenants, watch commanders. The gentleman sitting next to the woman, he was demoted without cause just before he was to get off of probation, and without cause. And he went to the chief and asked, well, what's this about? And chief says, if you don't like it, you can quit. Well, he decided he was going to be an attorney. He went to school at night, became an attorney, then a Superior Court judge, and then a very successful attorney. But many Black men, including Tom Bradley, who went on to be the mayor of Los Angeles, who was also an LAPD officer, they could only go as far as lieutenant. That's as far as segregation would allow them in the department. But the irony of it is they could only go so high in the LAPD, but obviously if you can become the mayor of the city of Los Angeles, you obviously should be able to promote an LAPD. And if you can become a Superior Court judge, you should be able to at least maintain your position as a lieutenant. So there's a lot of historical significance, but you're right. Black people, as a part of that great migration out of the South, they looked to Los Angeles as a place of opportunity. W.E.B. Du Bois, when he came to Los Angeles at the turn of the last century, he touted Los Angeles as a place of great opportunity for Black people and encouraged them to leave the South and come to places like Los Angeles. And Josh, as you probably learned through just visiting, it's a wonder we never ran into each other because I was a staple at the Southern California Library social studies right there on Vermont, spent a lot of time there. Yeah. As you know, Carlotta Bass, her newspaper, she donated all of that information, but Black woman who ran the newspaper in the city of Los Angeles, Carlotta Bass, was a socialist, and she documented the history of Los Angeles and fought a lot of the battles. So Los Angeles's history is so tied into the history of the Los Angeles Police Department. But I also know that the struggles internally with Black officers throughout that period was just as intense, and they were subjected to a lot of racial discrimination and segregation. But the two cannot be disconnected. And as we talk into the future, we see much of the change in social progress when it came to law enforcement reform was as a result of the actions of the Los Angeles Police Department.
So Josh, you talk in your book about the, about the history of the African-American community here in Los Angeles after, in the 40s and beyond. I imagine, right, and we know this from understanding sort of the personalities involved, that those white officers in leadership of LAPD were, that I think with an increased presence in the Black community, increased numbers, I think fair to say that there was a sense of, perhaps with these officers, a feeling under siege, a feeling like I need to contain and subjugate in some way. Can you talk a little bit about Bill Parker and Daryl Gates and a little bit about their mindset and the policies that they put into place after this great migration?
Yeah, and I defer to JT's experience on the streets over the last 20 years and have a lot of respect for that. And all I can say is before that, what I would observe is that, I think there was a period, and I talked about this a bit last time for those of you who had to suffer through my housing talk last time, but it became a very explicit, open duty of LAPD officers under the tenure of Parker, and certainly under and Gates, obviously, to maintain the racial space of the city, and this became an acute problem for them because prior to World War II, as JT mentions, right, there's this very positive sensibility among African Americans throughout the country, particularly in the South, that LA is W.E.B. Du Bois is welcoming them and encouraging them, and it lacks the history of racial violence that the South had and even some of the North. So, I think there was a moment where things were fairly calm. But what changes is the massive migration of World War II of African Americans out of the South. You've got like 4 million Blacks leaving the South between 1940 and 1970, and they're settling in cities, and and each city responds differently, but generally, there are differences of degree, but not kind. The response in LA is very much about controlling the line, and those have very very site specific. Like Alameda was very clearly the white curtain. You did not, for African Americans, you did not cross over into the communities east of Alameda, which of course would later become much more African American and Latino and Latinx now. But my point was maintaining the racial space of the city was an explicit charge under Parker, an explicit charge under Gates. We have the documents of that. It's well known. And it's very interesting. Each year it changes. It's like keep the Negroes north of whatever. Keep them north of 40th. Keep them north of 52nd. Each year that goes by, it's about keeping them kind of contained. And that, by the way, doesn't extend. That's not just about residents. That's about public space, beaches, parks. If you look at all the stuff that led up before the Watts riots of '65, there were all these skirmishes prior to that, where Black kids were going to just, recreate in Griffith Park or at the public pool or at the beach, and they're harassed and policed and surveilled and all those things and beaten up. And so there's a very strong history of that in the LAPD. I don't think it's unique. Obviously, it's not unique, right? It's every city in the United States inherited this racial mandate. I think it just came out of the colonial era. And without going too far back, I mean, you think about part of the reason that slavery even existed in the United States was, slavery followed an experiment with having Blacks and whites, poor Blacks and whites, both being indentured servants. And poor whites grew very tired of that. And so policing in its first instances was often about maintaining that racial line, and then that just continues on down the line. I want to say one more thing, and then I'll hand it back over to JT. But I want to. There's two main points I want to make tonight, and I'll make the second one in a minute. But the one point I want to make that I think a lot of people don't understand is that we think about the problem of policing minority communities as a problem of heavy-handedness or racism or outright violence or homicide. And that is certainly part of the story. But interestingly, for so much of the early part of the 20th century, Blacks were complaining about under-policing. It was the double indignity of being Black in a white city, was that when you encounter police, they have no respect for your civil liberties. And then when you need the police, they don't bother to come. And there's no ambulance service, there's no nothing. So that double indignity was so galling. And I think that gets lost a little bit in our contemporary debates about the spectacular instances with George Floyd and hundreds of others, thousands of others. It's not always been about violence, it's also been about total neglect. And that's one of the legacies of that earlier period.
JT, do you want to comment on that? That sort of that legacy.
Yeah, and Josh is so right, because when you look at the history of policing, it really came from slave patrols. It really has its genesis in slave patrols, and it really was all about what Josh mentioned, keeping Blacks either physically, geographically confined to certain areas, or just knowing their place in American society as people, as their humanity, and the Los Angeles Police Department, under Parker and Gates, that was a continuation of that, because I can tell you definitively, growing up in South LA, it was, there were places that I look back on it now, but it was just the way you had to survive. For instance, if me and my friends as teenagers wanted to go to Venice Beach, and there were four of us, and we could all fit in one person's car, there's no way in hell all four of us were going to go in that one car to Venice Beach, because that was akin to riding four deep, four Black males, teenagers in a car. We knew we were going to get stopped. So that whole policing by geography and apartheid mentality, keeping you in certain places. And there were very clear delineations as to where, Black people could live, because there were racial covenants. There were neighborhoods that Black people could not buy homes. I don't care what your income was. And a classic example was when Nat King Cole bought his home in Hancock Park. He had to have somebody else buy it. So here is a world-renowned entertainer who the racial covenants in Los Angeles precluded to where he could actually live. And I go back to my experience as a teenager, and even as you going to UCLA. I lived on campus my first year at UCLA. Every year after that, I commuted from Westwood to South Los Angeles, right about Western. Then it was Santa Barbara, Western and Martin Luther King Boulevard is where I lived. And I drove. I had a pretty beat up car, and I could not get on the freeway because it would fall apart. So I had to drive down Wilshire Boulevard. So Wilshire Boulevard from Westwood to Wilshire and Western was probably the most dangerous part of my 3 years from sophomore to senior year, because I lost count of how many times I'd get stopped. And I never will forget, I had an officer tell me after pulling me over, and explaining, I'm a UCLA student, I live here, I commute. I never will forget, he told me, you have no business being west of La Brea. In my mind, I'm thinking, well, how am I ever going to get to school? So yes, that mentality of policing by virtue of intimidation, geography, where you should and should not be, that was real. And I'm talking, right up until, like the 80s. And even now, there's been times when I have been stopped, and I tell this story oftentimes, where, I'm it's a clear demarcation of, I'm a Black man first because I'm talked to one way before they know I'm a cop. And definitely once they find out I'm a chief, it becomes yes, sir. So I always go from this very almost degrading attitude of how I'm talked to when I'm first stopped to once they see my identification and find out what I do, that it's like there's no denial. So I cannot look at my role in law enforcement as something that I can separate because I don't get the opportunity. But Parker and Gates, and I wouldn't just blame it on them. That whole generation prior to, that was the way it was an us versus them mentality. And when I came on LAPD in 1984, there was very little talk about community policing, very little talk about, it's much better now. There's definitely talk, and you do get training on that, but that was not a part of my training as a young officer.
On the flip side of things here, right, and on the criminal justice side of things, I understand that during this time of this post-war era, there was also the DA's office had a lot to do with sort of helping to reify this situation of racial, of keeping racial space intact. Particularly the DA Ira Reiner, who sort of went towards prosecuting every crime, no matter how minor, and really not offering any opportunities towards plea bargaining, and certainly towards IDing people aggressively as affiliated with gangs. And I'm really curious, right? Because I grew up on the west side of Los Angeles, and my early associations with South Central Los Angeles were that of gang territory, turf wars, right? I'm really curious how that sort of, how much of the understanding of gangs and gang violence, how much of that was real? How much of that was sort of reified by the police and the criminal justice establishment, right? To create this myth of of gangs. And how do we understand that sense of policing as helping to quell violence and not make it worse?
Well, I'll say it was real. I'll be the first to say, if you live in South LA, that was real. It was real. I think the response was at times an over reaction to it. And back to my statement, and Josh, I'll let you finish. Unless you address the trauma in those communities, unless you address issues that cause those young Black boys and brown boys to be a part of that officer's reality, policing is just a manifestation of a broken system. When I look at it from the standpoint of there's high crime there, and of course, I think Josh alluded to it. When a community is under siege from violence, and there's people getting killed and drugs on the street and blighted communities, that's one small part of what needs to be fixed. And I think the easy part is to point the blame and say, high crime area, let's put the police in there. Problem goes away. It's not that simple. We know this, but we've still been responding in the same way. Just my 2 cents on that.
Yeah.
Right? There's a history of sort of flooding the zone with hundreds, up to 1,000 police officers in a given area.
I was there. I remember when I was working gangs, but when Daryl Gates decided that South LA was under such attack from gang violence and crack cocaine, that there were these 1,000 officer task force. So literally 1,000 officers in South Los Angeles, where everything was pretty much criminalized. And the only thing that was successful in doing, and the rest of the nation can thank Los Angeles for that, is it flushed the criminals across country, because what they did was they decided, it's not as heavily police presence in places like Arizona or Oklahoma. So they went to other places while these 1,000-officer task forces were in place, because they would always announce them, which wasn't smart. They announced that, yeah, there's going to be 1,000 officers in South LA this weekend to combat crime. What did the gang members do? They just left, came back after the weekend was over. But they found out that, hey, if we go to places that they're not as, familiar with LA street gangs, we can set up shop. And that's what they began to do. That's why you have Crips and Bloods in places across the country, because LA, that failed attempt in dealing with the gang problem, really just spread it across the country. But that's a failed policy. That's a policy that just didn't work, because again, it resulted in mass incarceration, and it still did not deal with the causal factors, which were the trauma in those communities.
Mm-hmm.
So how do we square this idea of, right, what's the LAPD tagline, right? Protect and serve. How do we hold that motto, right, against a policy like these 1,000 police officer task force, or this idea of the vision of the LAPD officer, in Dragnet, or right, that vision of the sleek looking police officer. How do we balance those two visions of what it means to police and look good versus to police and serve a community?
The community has to be a part of it. It really does, because I can tell you definitively, I was working for Bill Bratton in his office when, and I got to give him credit, because in a lot of ways he was somewhat of a visionary, and he was not afraid to deal with issues of race. I worked with him, and Bill Bratton, he's probably the only white person I've ever talked to who has zero fear of talking about race, to the point where I felt uncomfortable. But that's the kind of conversations you have to have. You have to have those uncomfortable conversations. But it wasn't until he decided we should partner and start working with gang interventionists and working with non-traditional community partners. LA didn't start making an impact on reducing violent crime until we began to work with gang interventionists, and not in a way that they were snitches. They were utilized as partners, and they were the ones that basically had the street credibility and understood what was going on. And not only that, most of them were former gang members themselves. So once we tapped into the fact that they wanted the same thing that we wanted, and we utilized them in a respectful, collaborative partnership manner, we began to turn the tide on reducing gang violence.
I want to make sure that we have a chance to touch on that more a little bit later, but I want to make sure that we have a chance to remind the folks that are here. Some of you may have lived through this. I was rather young at the time, but the Rodney King beating, and right, we're familiar with Trayvon Martin and George Floyd in such recent times, but take us back, Josh, to the Rodney King beating and a little bit of what came out of that, the Christopher Commission, and some of the halting attempts at reform in the wake of that decision.
Yeah, I mean, as JT can attest better than I can, but I think anybody who saw that knows that there was nothing unusual going on there. It was just that it was captured on video, right? That was the thing. And it's interesting talking to students every day. The young ones, they have a sense that police violence against African Americans is increasing, but I think it's probably not true. The evidence suggests it's probably not true. There's probably more. There's probably fewer terribly racist officers now than there were in the past. It's just that they're on camera all the time. so I think part of what the Rodney King beating did was just revealed to everybody, all the viewers around the world, by the way, what every African American already knew, was just this is how things are done. And we have a lot of evidence of that going back in LA in particular in the 30s and 40s. African Americans beaten, killed. It was just very common. It was not unusual. So I think that, but back to that particular moment, and I'm speaking now as somebody who observed it, was alive, though younger. But I think you can't separate it from the whole lead up, which was, the Latasha Harlan's story, and that, and her name is not cited as often as Rodney King's, but I know that it means just as much, and there's still people who, celebrate her birthday and celebrate her death day, and I mean that girl Latasha Harlan, who was murdered in the market, and then to be given this, the woman who shot her, was given essentially a slap on the wrist, community service, and involuntary manslaughter. And I think that so anyway, long before the Rodney King verdict, the first verdict, there was already such a groundswell of a legitimate feeling that the justice system just does not apply to us. Like, we cannot get justice. And of course, the moving of the jury to Simi Valley and all of those things, really confirmed what Black people have been saying forever, which is that they can't get any justice. And I don't apologize for violence. I mean, it was obviously a terrible decision for people to go and destroy the neighborhoods, because it only perpetuated the stereotypes about people in South LA. Mm-hmm. It only increased insurance rates. It only drove out businesses. So, in terms of its efficacy as a strategy, it was a nightmare. But I understand that this sense that you cannot get justice. And then again, the Christopher Commission, again, it revealed the things that everyone already observed, and revealed the kind of depth of racist behavior. And I since I teach, I just can't help resorting to PowerPoint here, but I want to just say one thing about this, then I'll come back to it. But if you allow me to share this, part of what I wanted to emphasize is that so the Christopher Commission revealed, as everyone already knew, the extent to which there were officers who were repeat offenders, and a group of them, maybe 180 or so, were multiple offenders. I mean, to people who had complaints against them 16, 17 times, not unlike our officer here in the George Floyd incident. And so I think the Christopher Commission exposed to a white public, perhaps, the depth of racism that Black people already understood. And I just mentioned this meme here that you're probably aware was circulating at Harbor Division in February, which reveals again the extent of this curse of racism within law enforcement. But what I want to say, and I won't belabor the point now, I want to come back to it. But what I want to say, and it touches on JT's point about the history of trauma in these communities, is that if we're trying to understand the problem, or for example, why African Americans are disproportionately caught up in the criminal justice system, it would be a mistake for us to put all of the emphasis on policing. And that is something that JT's acknowledged and that Eric, we're all aware of. But I do want to talk about that when the time's appropriate, is that, policing is this, the tip of the spear in a system that has many areas in which young Black men in particular are ensnared. And one of the things I worry about with all the protests that came out in the last summer after George Floyd, which I believe inspired, Eric, some of this discussion that we're having, if I remember our earlier discussions, right, is that it puts all the emphasis on racist cops as the source of the problem, which which, as you can tell, I think is it's inexcusable that this exists. But to focus on that instead of all these other elements of the justice system, I think misses the point and limits our ability to respond in a thoughtful way. So I'll talk more about that if it's welcome in a few minutes. But I wanted to just say that.
So so that was the George Floyd, Trayvon Martin of a couple of decades ago, of a number of decades ago. And this wasn't the only, there was more to come, right, in the Gates administration, right? And so I'm curious if you could also, or JT as well, you could take us through a little bit of what led to the consent decree that sort of finally led to the ouster of Gates and at least the attempts to hire folks in leadership of LAPD that lead towards reform, Rampart and all of that stuff.
Once I unmute myself, touching on something Josh said, and I'll just real quick, I'm glad he mentioned Latasha Harlan, because I don't think there would have been the outcry after, there wouldn't, you can't separate what happened to Latasha Harlan with the verdict, and because many Black people felt like, well, now that it was captured on video, surely there's going to be justice, surely, and then the word was, in the community was, if these guys get off after it's been captured on video, then, there's no hope. This is acceptable. We must, it was just, that was the mentality. So you can't separate, because I think people were willing to not take any actions to the streets after Latasha Harlan. And I'm like Josh, I don't justify it. I think the only losers in the response, the rioting and destruction was the Black community, because there's still places that never rebuilt. So but you cannot, and you're right. This has always happened. Now, for the first time, it's captured on video. Now we will have justice. And when it didn't happen, that's what resulted in it. But to the Christopher Commission and what led to Daryl Gates' ouster, I think, in a lot of ways, Daryl Gates, and I knew him. I knew Daryl Gates personally. He could not separate his own identity away from LAPD. When the LAPD was attacked, he took it personal. He was never able to look at the LAPD as something separate. And I think in a lot of ways, his failure to own up to the causal factors and the decisions that he made led to all the things that happened. And it was all good. The reform and the Christopher Commission and the studies, and I was one of the officers that was interviewed by the Christopher Commission to talk about, from my perspective as growing up in South LA, and what are your experiences in the LAPD? Do you deal with racism in the LAPD? So I know what their intent was, but I still think that, despite all of the reforms that came out of, that, and that came out of Rampart, we're still back to where we are, because the issues of training and educating in a different way and recruiting hasn't changed. When I look at departments, and LAPD is a great department, do not get me wrong. I would say 99% of the officers that I work with, they join the LAPD for great reasons. They want to make a difference. But I do know that over the course of an officer's career, that first 3 years, there's an incredible amount of cynicism that builds up, because you see so much negativity, and no one really addresses that. No one ever accounts for that during the course. It's like, you go back out there and it's nothing to ensure wellness. So the mark has been missed repeatedly because the Christopher Commission and the other studies that happen and all of those, it doesn't address the human factor. It doesn't address, there's nothing in place to ensure that an officer stays, optimistic as they are the day that they graduate, where they all want to join because they want to do great things and would have noble intentions. But nobody addresses the causal factors, which oftentimes is you see things that most humans don't see, don't experience, but nobody deals with the psyche of the officer. And again, when you look at how departments recruit, it's no wonder if you're appealing to the adrenaline side of a human, as this is an adventure, it's and all those things, that's what you're going to get. And when that doesn't happen, you tend to look at, well, geez, maybe I can make some things happen. So there's a lot of internal issues within the culture of not just LAPD, but law enforcement in general, that I hope as a result of George Floyd and this moment in time, it gets fixed. Because if we don't get it fixed this time, I'm not too sure it'll ever get fixed. And I'm not too sure that this isn't the type of policing that America really wants, so just my 2 bits from an insider.
Yeah.
On the criminalization side, I'm curious, right? If as we move sort of out of the sort of to the apex of let's call it difficult policies within LAPD, and we sort of turn our attention towards the reforms that have been made. I'm curious if we could talk a little bit about some of the background behind and the legacy of the 3 strikes rules in California and how that affected incarceration rates and how that affected Black communities and brown communities in California or in Los Angeles.
I could take that. Yeah, I mean, JT, that was very interesting to me, by the way. I had not thought about that, about officer psychology after that first couple of years. I learned a lot from that. I wanted to just talk briefly about going back to my point about the kind of the narrowness of our public discourse about the criminal justice system, and what I believe is probably an overemphasis on just the tip of the spear, right? Just the policing angle. And so again, if you'll indulge me over here, PowerPoint for a minute. So I showed this slide to just remind us of the currency of these issues. But I take JT's point seriously that most people he interacted with were not like this. And I think that bears out what I think sounds right to me. And so to me, there's these other, so I wanted to go through just a couple numbers very quickly, and just please indulge me. I promise it'll be quick. But I like to have some specificity with these things. So we know that, first of all, we know that these horrible, unspeakable things here. We also know that there are very real racial differences in how, if you sort of equalize all other topics or variables, that you do see that even when Blacks are not when they're not attacking, officers are much more likely to be killed. And these numbers are very well supported by FBI data. Okay, so we know there is a problem in racial bias in use of force. We know that these spectacular failures here, and I'm not trying to minimize those at all. What I want to suggest, and of course the incarceration rates, but I want to just talk briefly about this era of mass incarceration, which I think we're sort of coming out of right now, or at least criminologists think that we are. And so let me just start very quickly here with this idea of arrest, incarcerate, repeat, which was the kind of dominant, nobody was saying it explicitly, but which was the design behind most elements of the criminal justice system. And it's not surprising here, as we all know, that this begins to spike with the war on drugs. But there's another element to this that a lot of people don't talk about, which is we've got this war on drugs, We also have the expansion, a kind of militarization of police in the 70s and 80s. But but there is this other element here, this Uniform Determinate Sentencing Act of 76, and it's really quite important because this was a bill that was signed in California by, is encouraged by Jerry Brown. So you would expect it to satisfy a kind of liberal desire for racial equity, and that was his motivation. But it was also supported by conservatives who thought it would lead to longer jail sentences. And so very quickly, if you look back at the history of California, the California Penal Code and the justice system, we had this thing basically back to the early 20th century of indeterminate sentencing. And that would be, if you think of the old classic movies, you commit a crime and the sentence is 5 to life. Well, that is a huge potentially period of time, right? And the idea of that was that it gave judges discretion to limit those terms based on the idea that these people would have incentive to rehabilitate. And the theory behind that was that the punishment fit the criminal rather than the crime. And that was kind of the dominant way of the justice system up until the 50s. And at that time, we moved toward something that would preview this. The real legacy of this sentencing act was that it created what would later become known as mandatory minimums. And I don't think you can really understand any of this without getting to this mandatory minimum. That is, doesn't matter your record, it doesn't matter anything. It doesn't matter your circumstances. You commit X offense, you get X amount of time. And that elimination of judicial discretion, I think, in conjunction with the war on drugs, created a system where people are doing longer and longer and longer sentences for crimes which they may have been slapped on the wrist for a generation earlier. So I really think that's a critical part of making this mass incarceration system. Final little point here. So ways to fix this would be to eliminate the mandatory minimum. There is some rollback on that every time we go to the polls. People are saying, well, maybe we should reevaluate that, but it still is a dominant feature across the United States. The other thing that we're moving toward, and I know for a fact that JT's been involved in some of this with that Falcon program, I think it's called, that you were part of, JT, but pretrial diversion, getting people into some sort of treatment or counseling rather than sending them right to jail. And the newly rebuilt MLK Behavioral Health Center, I think, is an example of that. The final point is this, what I think is this just immoral system of cash bail, which we had an opportunity last year to get rid of, and we voted as Californians to keep it. But getting rid of cash bail and replacing that would be an amazing way to make the justice system more equitable, because it's just an obvious point that people that can't afford the bail stay in jail, and they're in their prison for 2 weeks before they even see a judge. And this is I think it's shameful. I mean, it's basically just a plutocracy. It's, if you can afford to get out, you get out. If you can't, you can't. Final point on that. If you look at Twin Towers, they did a bunch of data analysis, 2019. Twin Towers is in effect the nation's largest de facto mental health facility. It's not supposed to be, it just is. And here we have this data, it's like 30% entire jail population has serious disorder, 60% with serious substance abuse. And so, this is very much, I think, consistent with what JT was sharing about the trauma that exists in these communities, is that the police interaction is just one piece of it. But there are all these stumbling blocks that allow a young kid who's not thinking clearly to get himself into just endless trouble and never to be able to pull out of it. So that, to me, is where we should be focusing our energy. As police get better, I think we need to make sure the justice system catches up. And so that's where I think our energy should be. Sorry for the a little bit long-winded, but that's the idea.
So JT, this is where we have to rely on your closeness to the the hallways of hallways of LAPD power. I really would love for you to share with us. The consent decree comes out.
Mhm.
How do officers start thinking about talking about realigning the LAPD, moving itself to abide by the terms of that consent decree? And what are the, sort of the nuts and bolts changes that Brad and others made in order to, comport ourselves in accordance with that consent decree?
First you got to look at probably the overriding thing is always going to be culture, because you're never going to institute rules, regulations in any large organization like the LAPD and think that that alone is going to change and cause officers to behave differently. There has to be a whole paradigm shift in the culture. And I think where Bratton, so to answer the question about what specifically resulted for the line level officers from the consent decree, be perfectly honest, not a whole bunch. It really didn't, because by the time it got down to the street level, it was just, okay, now you have to do this, this, and this. Most of it, there was nothing to monitor, ensure accountability. Now, there were things like, okay, now every time you write a citation, you have to determine, what the constitutionality of it was. You have to log the race of the individual, and there were certain things like, when I was a watch commander, as somebody was arrested, there's now a form that says now you've got to ask them, are you sick, ill, or injured, and did the officer treat you okay? Yeah, those are little things you check the box and say, yeah. But that does not equate to compliance. And that doesn't get at the heart of the issue. And the issue is culture, and if the culture suggests that it's us versus them, that's not going to go away real quick. And then one of the big overriding issues with Los Angeles, it's such a big city. And there's such a huge volume of calls, radio calls, when you're working in some of the very busy divisions, which now pretty much all of them are busy, that you just get to the point where it becomes, you got to keep people safe. People are calling you because they need help. People are calling you because, I'm a mother and I'm in the room locked in the closet because my husband wants to beat me, and he's tearing up the house, and can you get here quick? And they're whispering. You don't really have a whole bunch of time to do anything other than get there and save that family and take care of the situation. So there's an overriding urgency to a police work that I don't think people take in consideration when you look at, what are the impacts of, check a box and you did this, you did. You got to attack the culture. And that's a much more difficult thing to do, but it can be done. And I just didn't see a whole lot that was done, because that involves what are you looking for when you recruit? How are you training? How are you holding people accountable? What are you promoting? It's a lot broader when you talk about changing the culture than it is. Here's a bunch of stats. Here's what we've got. Here's how many people we stopped that were Black, that were brown, and all of those things that really, in a lot of ways, I don't want to minimize the work of the Christopher Commission, but when it got down to my level, and at that time, I think I was a sergeant, it was more or less, you got to do this now. You got to do this now. You got to do this now. And the officers just did it, but they weren't told exactly why. Nobody ever said, okay, now we're going to train differently. Now, when you get your performance evaluation, you're going to be evaluated on not how many arrests that you've made, but the quality of your interactions with members of the public. Did you mentor a kid? Did you, those kinds of things that you didn't have time for. So, Rabbi, I hope, I answered your question somewhere in there, but it wasn't as clear as the Christopher Commission made recommendations. and we got them, as opposed to whether there was substantive change. I think the substantive change began to happen under Bratton when, quite honestly, he got rid of all of the people that felt like they weren't going to go along with, being better stewards of our responsibility to serve and to protect all of the people, and I remember working with him, and his every other word out of his mouth was partnership. That's his Boston accent. It was partnerships. So he was all about building partnerships with the community, and trying to go about building relationships that mattered. So I think, and he was off to a good start, but it always goes back to when crime starts going up. Okay, all of that community policing stuff is good, but we've got 5 shootings in this division. What's going on? So the urgency of rising crime always causes police to pivot toward that and get away from this. So it never has a chance to really take root. That's just my opinion of it.
I'm really struck what you're sharing, right, about how the urgency of a call or of a shooting, God forbid, right, is going to take away from, what you might see as the important infrastructure, or community partnership infrastructure that sort of is the, we talk about what's the difference, what's the opposite of the tip of the spear, right? What undergirds it all.
And Eric, the issue with that is the community wants you to, all they care about is you getting here fast and helping me in my moment of crisis. So there's an urgency with them too. So, it becomes, and then the other thing I think people forget, when that 911 call comes and that woman is calling and they're cowered in a closet, hiding from an abusive husband or boyfriend, who you can hear, that dispatcher can hear causing holy hell on the other end. Those officers, be they white, black, male, female, gay, straight, they're coming 100 miles an hour, and they don't care what you look like. They don't care what your race is, and that's where a part of I get confused, because even the most diehard racist, that officer is still going to respond 100 miles a minute, and they're going to do what they need to do to help that situation, because that's what you're wired to do. So a lot of that goes out the window when they hear that call. They're not going to respond any slower or less urgent if that person on the other end is black, brown, purple, pink, straight, gay, whatever.
I'm glad to hear, at the very least, right, you had shared before, right, that there was the double blow of the community being under policed, right? I'm glad to hear that at least there's a presence, right, and a responsiveness to Black communities looking for, calling for help when they need it. I think that's obviously positive. I'm really curious because Bill, Chief Bratton is well known for the policy of stop and frisk, more famously in New York, and as carried out by his successor in New York. But I know that that was a piece of what he brought to the table in Los Angeles. I'm really curious how you understood that policy, and how did we do it in a good way, or how was it done differently, in a way that didn't result in an Eric Garner situation that we had in New York. What makes Los Angeles and that policy of stop and frisk different than what we found in New York City in that situation?
I'm not quite sure what happened in New York. I don't have enough information to how it got off the rails. But stop and frisk is really all about taking care of little issues to ensure that bigger crimes don't occur. The one thing that we was always preached to when Bratton was in LA is constitutionally. You have to police constitutionally. If you're stopping and frisking someone without provocation, that's illegal. You don't get to do that. And, I don't know how that became what it was in New York, but, it still, really was, and I think people oversimplified what, and maybe it's just me, but I do believe that, it was something different and it was interpreted different, but, um, eh, but really, it really came down to, stopping someone if you had a legitimate reason and it was constitutional. And that was, somewhat bastardized, with what happened I saw in New York. But New York is a whole different type of department, whole different type of, city, a whole different type of urgency, I would assume. But I think what happens when crime starts going up, that's when you start seeing, officers stretching a little bit of their authority beyond, and the ends begin to justify the means, and officers start taking those shortcuts. But that's where we don't get to do that. We're not supposed to do that. And we have violated the trust that is entrusted upon us by the people that we serve. So, just my thoughts on that. But Bratton at LA, if you wanted to get on his list, let it get to him that, there was you behaving unconstitutionally. Not to say that nobody ever did. I'm not that naive to think, because, it happens. But at the same time, the culture is such that oftentimes, officers under the stress of urgency and busy, and, shots fired here, man with a gun here, domestic violence here, child abuse here, all in one night. You start getting a little punch drunk, and you start thinking, and that's where the cynicism comes in. That's when an officer starts thinking, this is too much. This is not normal, but they don't have any way of decompressing that. There's nobody talking to them about that. There are times when I was working in busy divisions where, literally I felt like I was shot out of a cannon, and next thing you know, it's this violent call, and particularly when I was working gangs, because a lot of what we were dealing with was, homicides. It was, one gang member shoots and kills another, and you hope you can get there in time to make a difference or stop it. And next thing you know, bam, there's another one, and back and forth all night. So it was very real, and those communities were under siege, but it was a manifestation of the broken system and not dealing with the community trauma that causes those young men to think that they were empowered with a gun in their hand. And it's such a low opinion of themselves that, they felt like they had nothing to live for. And a lot of these were the guys I grew up with, same mentality.
I think this question will probably take us a little farther afield, but I think it's important, right? Because so much of what both of you have been speaking about, right, is the sense that while the conversation is about policing and criminal justice, it's not about policing and criminal justice, right? There's so many more things at play. Curious, in addition to what from your perspectives, right? What is the practical kind of, like, if we're talking about the root fix, right? At the bottom of the iceberg, so to speak, that, of which the manifestation of, over policing and whatnot in criminal justice, over incarceration is just a symptom, right? If we were going to get to the root cause, what would that fix be? And do you see any sort of practical policy solutions moving forward?
Well,
I mean, fix the problem right now.
yeah. I mean, I would get in a time machine and eliminate slavery. I mean, or Jim Crow or any of these. I think they're intractable to a certain extent. And so, as much as the So as much as the fixes I described are addressing a symptom rather than a problem, and I think you've got that right. But the problem is it exists. I mean, it is the problem of perennial poverty and to use JT's term, trauma, and those are longstanding things. You know, it's so interesting to hear JT's response about, or thinking about the urgency of officers responding. And you know, if we set aside the glaring racial problem that is at the root of a lot of this, there's also this other just kind of material problem that the LAPD has been talking about since the 1920s, when the city first started getting a lot of people. You know, in the 20s, the population of the city doubled and it became very, you know, cosmopolitan. And at that moment and all the way to the present, there's been a consensus that there aren't enough people, and there aren't enough officers, and the city is too damn big. Excuse my French. I mean, and this goes back to the beginning, right? Is that you have kind of an untenable. In other words, I think Los Angeles as a concept is somewhat untenable. It is so vast, and you're expecting a number of officers, and JT can correct me, but I think it's half of New York City's maybe, or
Oh yeah, New York City has about 40,000 officers. LAPD has a little under 10,000.
Okay, so yeah, I was even being generous. I mean, so it's bad, and part of the dynamic that people observed going back to the 20s was that it's not just that you don't have a lot of law enforcement officers per capita, it's that you have from the beginning strangers patrolling strangers, you know, and that creates a dynamic. And even in my own neighborhood, I grew up in an Irish Catholic neighborhood in San Francisco, and everybody I knew was either went to SF Fire or SFPD. But you know, the difference there was that everybody patrolled neighborhoods where they knew everybody, and many of them lived in the city or grew up in the city. And so there was a kind of, I'm not suggesting that protected the city from horrible behavior, because there's been plenty of examples. I'm just saying that we have a system here where you have a vast area of people who are patrolling strangers. And so I presume, and I'm not an officer, I can't speak to the experience like JT can, but I have heard and read about that it creates an us versus them mentality on both sides, right? Mm-hmm. And so there's that structural problem in LA, which I think is a little bit more acute than it is in other places. And I don't know how you flood the city with new hires. I don't know the budget. I'm ignorant about the hiring and budget process, and maybe JT can help us with that. But I think that's a clear problem.
I'd say, Josh, you're spot on, you know, on both points. I think the big issue is the 10,000 pound gorilla in the room that, you know, America has never come to grips with, and that is race. You know, at the start of the American democracy, you know, you had, you know, a large percentage of its people that were enslaved, and they were enslaved for 200 some odd years, and then they were set free. And then, you know, their skin color became a stigma, and then came Jim Crow, then came all of the other things that happened, you know, as a result, you know, but you know, when I look at this, LA's, you know, you're spot on when you talk about LA was always trying to prevent more people from coming. You know, I recall reading where, you know, in the Dust Bowl period, LAPD, and you talk about stretching your jurisdictional authority.
Yes.
Set up border patrols at the border to keep and turn back the Okies coming from Oklahoma. Yeah. Turn them back around. So, you know, you always had this desire to not encourage people to come here that were lower rung, because these were people, it was always the poor and the disenfranchised, and regardless of almost, you know, what race, because it was the Chinese at one point, you know, and it was every immigrant group that came into LA until they were able to undergird themselves with a certain level of wealth and accomplishment. they were always the targets. But that was true of most major cities. But LA took it to another extreme, but at the same time, I think, when I look at, what needs to be done, I think it's and I know George Gascon, and I look at what he's trying to do, criminal justice, and I told him as recently as a couple of weeks ago, I think what you're doing is great. I just think that you need it. You can't do it by yourself. Your reform, you're gonna, because you cannot release individuals, because that's what's happening. Individuals that are, with all of his policies, individuals that would normally be incarcerated, they're being released. But what are you releasing them to? Still there's no employment. They still, many of them, they can't, they don't have the basic skills to hold a job. They become incarcerated. I mean, that mentality, there's nothing for them to do other than to resort back to, illicit and illegal activities to make a living, And now what you have is so many of them, they don't even have homes to return to, which is why our homeless population is through the roof. And on top of that, as Josh mentioned, Twin Towers is just a mental institution. So you're letting those individuals out. So I told George, I think you're on the right track, but you have that. I mean, it's almost like it's 50 years before everything else is caught up, because it's going to take massive investment into the trauma, because nothing's going to happen, nothing's going to change until a black and brown boys living in East LA look at themselves as having some value. The studies are there. The studies prove that if a black boy or a brown boy in South Los Angeles, East LA, does not know how to read by third grade, his chances of having a productive life is minimized exponentially, and that is the same individual that you can track from third grade to incarceration. And why is that? Because we have not undergirded and done anything to address that. We know what the problems are. I mean, it's not like, the studies aren't there. It's just we have not had the will or inclination to do it. And it's hard and it's expensive. But, I think 240 some odd years of slavery would kind of make you think, well, we got to fix this at some point, because otherwise, and then the other piece I get frustrated is because the burden is still on law enforcement. That young black or brown young man, his reality intersects with the police officers in oftentimes, confrontational ways. But we haven't addressed the traumas. We haven't addressed the issues that cause those life chances to be, what they are. And I look at my own life, mom never graduated high school, 6 kids, no dad. And, and I can only think that the reason I made it was, call it luck or call it people that were investing in me, outside of my family structure. But, those are, it shouldn't be happenstance. It shouldn't be, well, JT got through, what about, all of his buddies that he grew up with? They had value, and trust me, they did not want to go into gangs. They did not, that was not any part. None of us as, elementary kids said, we're gonna, half of us are, most of us are gonna be dead or, or in gangs or long-term incarceration. None of us talked about that as little boys. We talked about being cops, being doctors, being lawyers, being firefighters, having a family. Somehow, some way, that just never was in the card for most of them. And that's what has to be fixed. So if I could fix any of it, I would look at, let's get past our sensibilities and sensitivities about talking about race, and let's get at the issues, and not in a handout way, but just fixing it, just so that there's some better life chances. I know
So
that
I'm
was
hearing both of you talk through sort of this Gordian knot of where we find ourselves, and I'm appreciative that both of you sort of allowed us to zoom out here to understand a little bit more about that from your perspectives. You know, certainly the economics, the sense of life chances, right? That the racism, the classism, right? All of it that's sort of wrapped up into one. And as you say, try to address the issues as best as possible, knowing that, you know, while this is all, while we seek to address these particular issues, you know, everybody's got an eye, right? Throwing a corner of their eye on crime statistics, right? With the sense of, well, you know, at the minute things go up, let's put on the brakes and, you know, let's turn up the pressure, you know, potentially undoing, right? Using the urgency of the moment to, you know, perhaps undo some of the progress made, you know, that's slow and behind the scenes, you know, as you know, you were talking about, JT, that the you know, gang intervention work and the community policing work that I know we're going to be learning a lot more about in our next panel, where we're lucky that Deputy Chief Tinkerides, who's responsible for community policing in Los Angeles, is going to be speaking to us about those efforts and her successes and the department's successes and where they have yet to go. I'm going to ask the next panel this question, but you have, JT, you've sparked something so interesting, and Josh, you were right to pick up on it, right? This idea of those first 3 years of a cop, and you know, feeling that sense of cynicism that can come over you when you're working a difficult assignment and there's a lot thrown at you and not a lot of time to decompress, and not a lot of other people in the community who can help you to decompress. I certainly know that, you know, that is a feature known to doctors, known to, you know, lawyers, certainly known to rabbis. And I'm curious, and a number of people have been asking in the chat, what's going on with self-care for police departments? Is there a, and I'm going to say a feasible opportunity for police officers to avail themselves of psychological help, spiritual help? Are those the kind of resources that are provided, but you know, it's a little taboo to use them, right? What's at the core there, or is that an area that's yet to be addressed?
Did you want me or Josh to address that?
I think, JT, if you brought it up, so I think you get first.
I would say, you know, not enough. You know, most departments have nothing in place, literally nothing. It's almost like if an officer gets into a shooting, then it's okay to get some psychological counseling. Absent that, most departments, don't have anything, and the officer has to, seek that on his or her own. But there's that culture and that stigma, as you suggested, Eric, that just, do you really want to be known as the officer who's in therapy? And I think every cop should be in therapy on a regular basis, just to sort out and minimize the cynicism and deal with what you deal with. But there's such a stigma, and it's still pervasive. It's less. When I came on, you would not dare talk about going to, talk to someone about something you're experiencing as a result of the stressors of the job. So, and one of the things that the President Obama's 21st Century Task Force on Policing talks about is one of the pillars is wellness. You have to get at how does that officer show up at work? And that's one of the things I tell all of my supervisors. You got to know your people. Officers are human. They could be going through, you name any human condition, a messy divorce, a kid who's fighting cancer, primary caregiver for a terminally ill parent, all those things. And that officer shows up to work. and we're expecting them to handle what's thrown their way. And keep in mind, most of them are pretty young. I started right from UCLA. I was 21, and and now I'm handling domestic violence issues and trying to help people who have been at each other's throat for 20, 30 years. And I'm now having to deal with, how do I get this child out of this abusive household? This is the 5th time this week I've looked at a dead body and those kinds of things. And I'm 21 years old. I'm a kid right out of college. And we now know studies prove that, brains aren't even completely formed until like 25. Yet we're talking about putting a 21-year-old kid out there to deal with all of those. And not to say that's every officer's reality, but it's a very real reality for a Los Angeles police officer, or New York or Chicago or Dallas, but nothing really is done to address those factors either, in addition to the crime, in addition to all the other factors.
Yeah, it's so striking that, you started out talking about addressing the trauma of the underlying community, and how interesting that there's, a latent trauma that can come up in the life of a police officer who's, without being able to decompress and work through, whether it's an acute shooting, as you said, or just, this is the 5th dead body I've seen this week and I'm 22 years old, right? That's trauma.
Yeah.
And I'm so grateful to, it's a sad realization, but I'm grateful for you drawing that out, that there's trauma on both sides.
And in order to deal with the racist officers, there are those, but not as many as I think the public thinks there are. I think a lot of some of the manifestations are as a result of implicit biases. When you think about it, most of my academy classmates, they came from other states. There were 65 of us in my academy class in 1984. Many of them came from other places in the country where they had never worked, places like South LA and East LA and West LA and places like that. Los Angeles was where they came to get a job, and they were from the Midwest. And they had never, the first Black people that they were meeting were cops in their academy class. But then you put them in a neighborhood like Watts, and all they have is stereotypes. And nobody's ever trained them that, that stuff is just not true. Yet, all they get is crimes and crimes and crimes. And there's a mentality that happens where there's an implicit bias, is that, Black people are violent, and I have to work through my own. I'm Black, but the majority of every time I was a victim of a crime growing up, it was a Black person that perpetuated. The majority of the people that I arrested have looked like me, unfortunately, so it's, there's a lot of things that need to be unpacked when it comes to the psyche of fixing law enforcement. And you got to fix rules and regulations and consent decrees and all of these check the box, do this, do this, do this, do this. You got to get at the heart of the issue. And the heart of the issue is, as long as cops are humans, you can deal with human conditions, and you got to work through those. And in order for officers to be reflective of what we want, got to be a greater investment in them as people, and how do you hire them? And again, I know I'm on my soapbox. An officer gets a psychological examination to come on the job, but the majority of the psychological damage occurs after they're on the job. And never, is there ever any other psychological assessment unless they're made to do it. There's never any background. I had to go through a background process when I came on LAPD. The only other time I had to go through one again was when I went to narcotics. And then it was just, yeah, he went through, he passed.
So as a way of closing this evening, because both of you have done us a great service in opening up so many issues, and there are more questions that we have than we know what to do with. And we are going to save many of them for our conversation about, next steps, right? More about mental health for officers, more about community policing efforts. That is all to come. I know there is an inherent tension in the idea of criminal justice, right? That as a society, we want to ensure that we bring to justice those people who perpetrate crimes.
That's important.
Right. While also, right, ensuring that we are treating those who are accused of perpetrating crimes justly and not over policing in communities and coming down more heavy-handedly. And that all comes down to trust. So I'm curious, from the both of you, to share a little bit about what's the way forward in terms of addressing racial inequity and trust when it comes to the criminal justice system. And I'll ask you, Josh, to start, and JT for you to close this out.
Yeah, I don't know. I'll share with you just an anecdote, just that, I taught at CSUN now for 15 years. And a growing proportion of the students are African-Americans, though it's still too small. Most of them are from Antelope Valley, and I think I mentioned this last time we talked, that the dropout rate, particularly during this pandemic, is really upsetting. That is, that first time African-American student freshmen are dropping out at a really high rate. And I only wanted to just mention this to kind of come back to JT's point about trauma, that when you start talking to students, it's absolutely no surprise that they're dropping out, because, in the same way, I mean, a different example, but in the same way that JT's talking about, officers show up and they're expected to handle all this and process all this. And the same can be true when you're going away from trauma towards something beautiful, like a college education, where the skills and the focus and all the things that you need to get through, you're still processing. These kids are still processing all these terrible experiences, and a lot of beautiful experiences too. I don't mean to make them sound monolithic, but every time I reach out to a student, there's a story about criminal justice or poverty or hardship that just reminds me, and should remind all of us, about the real challenges of getting through in one piece. And so I'm not on the streets, and I haven't done what JT's done, but I do take seriously the idea of keeping these students in school, whatever it takes. And I'm grateful to be here, and to Temple Judea, and to you, Eric, and particularly to you, JT. I hope we stay friends after this. This is
Yeah, for sure.
I love learning from you. So thank you you all. Yeah.
Same. And it's interesting, Josh, you stole my thunder again, because when I look at what was truly transformative for me in my life, growing up in South LA the way I did, was college education. It really, UCLA immersed me around people of all backgrounds, and I came to the realization we all want the same thing. And I learned so much, and these are my dearest friends even to this day, that are every color, every religion, and they're dear friends. And I think there's a value to that, not only transformative as a person, but it's the great equalizer. It really is, and it hurts me to hear Josh say that his students are dropping out, because that's an important piece of how do we get past these issues. And we have these kinds of conversations about race and whatever else that needs to be dealt with, because I truly believe that the answers are not easy ones. They're not easy. I think we've oversimplified them to make it easy for us to unpack. If we can easily look at and say the police are the problem, and it's the way police officers treat Black people or anyone, that's a shortcut. It really is.
Yeah.
Because growing up in those communities, I know police officers are needed. You talk about taking officers away from places like South LA. You got a lot of elderly people and hardworking families that are just going to be under siege. That's not the answer either. It's how they police. But the other part is, again, back to my original point, is it's going to take a massive investment and pivoting as to what we value as a nation. You know, do we really value equality? Do we really value, you know, diversity? Do we really want to stop, you know, this prison to pipeline, you know, and change the chances of a young African American and Latinx young boy who, you know, at, you know, early on are talking about being all the things that any American boy wants to be, and then somehow their life chances of that happening diminish, and next thing you know, they're in prison and incarcerated. What a wasted potential, because I can tell you sitting here, the guys I grew up with that didn't make it, most were very, very smart, very, very smart, and their potential just, it never was realized. So it comes down to whether or not we as a nation are going to invest in people that we know really need help to fix it generationally. That's my thoughts.
Josh, JT, thank you both for bringing us to that space of, and again, drawing us out from, you know, as we using police and criminal justice as an excuse, right, to talk about the much larger picture, and giving us that call to action. I would be remiss in my role as a rabbi and community leader if I didn't plug a couple of events and things for our community to know about, especially as it pertains to this. The Religious Action Center is currently in the midst of deciding its California legislative campaign, and there are some legislative pieces around criminal justice that you can lend your voice to say that it's important that the reform movement of Judaism, the Reform Jewish movement is advocating for those issues in Sacramento on the benefit of our community. So you can find that information in your e-news or in the TJ in Action Bulletin. But a week from, it's on Wednesday from 7 to 8:30 this Wednesday, or Thursday from 12 to 1:30. You can register for those conversations and let your voice be heard. How are you going to shape the way Reform Jews ally the communities that desperately need, you know, of us to help lift the voices that they're already crying out with. In addition, coming up, the second in our series is on police reform currently, and many of you have written in with questions of the two panelists tonight that I think will be great for the next conversation around police mental health, around intervention, gang intervention, around community policing and all of that. So I invite you to join us. We're going to be joined by Errol Southers, who is a former FBI officer and currently teaches at USC and is a colleague of Chief Thomas. We're going to be joined by Deputy Chief Imada Tingarides, who is the officer responsible for LAPD's Community Policing Initiative. And we're going to be joined by Connie Rice, the lawyer and activist who had so much to do and continues to have a lot to do with the ways that criminal justice acts and changes in this city. So I really, I hope you will join us for that panel. Again, thank you to the Racial Justice Initiative, to Dr. Sides, to Chief Thomas. Thank you so much for joining us, everybody, and have a great evening.
And I look forward to joining you in the future, just as a listener. I'd love to be listening in on some of the future panels that you have.
We would love to have you. And there's a lot of love coming in from the participants, some thanks, some claps, and some loves, and some all of the Zoom emojis.
Okay.
You guys.
Thank you all. Be well.
Thank you all.
Take care.
Take care.